In the ancient Mediterranean world, long before the Roman Empire and centuries before modern democracies, a unique political experiment took shape. A world of independent city-states or polis that governed themselves, warred with each other, and shaped ideas that still echo today. Here's a surprising fact. Ancient Greece was never a unified nation during its classical height. Instead, it was a loose collection of hundreds of fiercely independent city-states: Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, each with its own government, army, and ambitions. Some were democracies, others oligarchies or militarized societies. Yet together, they laid the foundations of Western political thought, philosophy, art, and science. When we think of ancient Greece, we often imagine grand temples, powerful city-states, and famous philosophers. But before any of that existed, before Athens, before Sparta, before democracy or empires, there was a long period of instability and silence. This era, known as the Greek Dark Age, began around the year 1100 BCE. It followed the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization, one of the earliest advanced societies in the Greek world. That collapse didn't just bring down palaces and kingdoms. It wiped out writing systems, trade networks, and centralized rule. Greece entered a period where little was recorded and much was lost. But out of that silence, something new began to take shape. In the centuries that followed, between roughly 1100 and 800 BCE, a new kind of community emerged: the polis, or city-state. These were not simply towns or villages. The polis was a radically different way of organizing people, politics, and identity. It would become the defining feature of ancient Greek civilization for centuries to come. To understand how the polis emerged, we need to look at what changed after the fall of the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans had been ruled by warrior kings who built fortified palaces and controlled vast territories. Their society was highly hierarchical, dependent on scribes who wrote in a script called Linear B and linked to other Mediterranean powers through trade. But around the year 1100 BCE, all of that fell apart. Archaeological evidence shows widespread destruction of palaces across the Greek mainland. Trade routes collapsed. The Linear B script disappeared. Populations shrank. Literacy was lost. Why did this happen? Scholars still debate the causes. Some point to invasions by sea raiders, others to internal strife or environmental disasters. Perhaps it was a combination. What is clear is that central authority vanished, and Greece entered a long period of decentralization and fragmentation. During this so-called Dark Age, which lasted for roughly 300 years, Greek communities became smaller, more isolated, and more self-reliant. People lived in scattered villages rather than urban centers. Without centralized kings, power shifted to local leaders, often the heads of extended families or clans. These local elites would eventually evolve into aristocracies in the early city-states. It was also during this period that the Greeks began to forge new identities. Old Mycenaean traditions faded, and new customs emerged. People buried their dead differently. Pottery styles changed. The old palace economies disappeared, replaced by more modest systems of exchange. And while this may seem like a time of decline, it was also a time of slow transformation. By the 9th century BCE, around the year 900, signs of recovery began to appear. Settlements grew larger and more organized. Communities began building communal structures, such as temples and meeting spaces. One of the most important changes was the reintroduction of writing, around the 8th century BCE. But this time, instead of reviving the old Mycenaean script, the Greeks adopted a new system based on the Phoenician alphabet. This would eventually become the Greek alphabet, one of the first scripts to include full vowels, making it easier to write the sounds of spoken language. As literacy returned, so did the ability to record laws, histories, and poetry. This was the time when Homer's epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were first composed orally and later written down. These poems did not describe contemporary life, but they helped shape Greek values, ideals, and a shared cultural memory. They glorified heroic warriors, honored the gods, and told stories of pride, honor, and community. They were not just entertainment. They were part of a cultural revival. But the most important development of this period was the birth of the polis. Unlike the kingdoms of the Mycenaean world or the empires of the Near East, the polis was built around a shared sense of citizenship. It was not ruled by a single king or external empire. Instead, it was a community of citizens who took part in political, religious, and military life. Each polis was independent, with its own laws, customs, army, and institutions. Some were democracies, some were oligarchies, and some were ruled by tyrants. But all of them shared this core idea. The city-state belonged to its citizens. The physical layout of a polis typically included an acropolis, or high place, where temples and fortifications were built, and an agora, or public space, where people gathered for markets and assemblies. The land around the city provided farmland, which was crucial for survival. A polis was not just a city, it included the surrounding territory and villages as well. Why did the polis emerge in Greece and not elsewhere? One reason may be geography. Greece is a land of mountains, valleys, and scattered islands. This natural fragmentation made it difficult to unify large territories. Instead, small, self-sufficient communities developed in isolation. Over time, they formalized their local structures into fully functioning city-states. Another reason was cultural. The Greeks valued autonomy and participation. They developed a strong sense of local identity. Being Athenian, Spartan, or Corinthian mattered more than being Greek in a broader sense. This localism encouraged competition, innovation, and pride, but also frequent conflict. By the 8th century BCE, the polis was fully established as the dominant political unit of the Greek world. Some city-states grew wealthy through trade, others through agriculture. Many began sending out colonies across the Mediterranean, especially in southern Italy, the Black Sea, and the coast of Asia Minor. These colonies were independent polis themselves, connected by shared language and culture but politically separate. This expansion helped spread Greek ideas far beyond the Aegean. By the start of the 8th century BCE, Greece was no longer a land of isolated villages and fading memories. The polis had taken root, reshaping Greek life through new forms of government, social organization, and shared identity. But something else began to stir during this time. A revival that transformed the Greek world from inward-looking local communities into outward-facing powers connected by trade, colonization, and cultural expansion. The period from around 800 to 600 BCE is known as the Archaic Age. It was a time of rapid growth and innovation. Populations rose, cities expanded, and long-distance trade networks re-emerged. Most significantly, Greek city-states began to establish colonies far beyond the Aegean, reaching the shores of Italy, Sicily, North Africa, and the Black Sea. This was not colonization in the modern imperial sense, but rather the founding of new, independent city-states by Greeks seeking land, trade, and opportunity. This era marked Greece's first real outward expansion since the collapse of the Mycenaean world. The driving forces behind it were both practical and strategic. As populations grew, many polis faced a shortage of arable land. Internal conflicts over land distribution and political control became common. In many cases, tensions between aristocratic elites and rising merchant classes created instability. For young men without inheritance or political power, emigration offered a fresh start. When a polis decided to found a colony, the process was formal and ritualized. A group of citizens, often led by an appointed founder called an oikistes, would be sent out to establish a new settlement. The colony would be independent but maintained religious and cultural ties with its mother city. These ties were important in maintaining diplomatic and trade connections, but politically, the colony governed itself. One of the earliest and most influential colonizing cities was Corinth, located on the narrow isthmus that connected mainland Greece to the Peloponnese. Its strategic location made it a natural hub for trade between the Aegean and the western Mediterranean. Under the rule of the Bacchiad family, and later the tyrant Cypselus, Corinth established colonies such as Corcyra, modern Corfu, and Syracuse in Sicily. These colonies not only secured trade routes, but also extended Corinthian culture and influence across the seas. Miletus, a powerful city on the coast of Asia Minor, also played a leading role in the colonization movement. Miletus founded dozens of colonies along the Black Sea coast, including Sinope and Odessos. These colonies opened access to valuable resources such as grain, timber, and metals, which were scarce in Greece itself. Miletus would later become known for its early philosophers and scientific thinkers, but in the Archaic period, its maritime reach helped define Greek expansion. The most famous colony of all was Massalia, founded by Phocaeans from Asia Minor on the southern coast of what is now France. Massalia, modern-day Marseille, became a key gateway for Greek goods and ideas into the Western Mediterranean and beyond. Through such cities, Greek language, art, pottery, and religion began to spread across regions that had never seen them before. This colonization was not just about economics or land. It also had religious and cultural dimensions. Before founding a colony, the mother city would consult the oracle at Delphi, seeking the approval of the god Apollo. This gave the expedition a sacred legitimacy. The Greeks believed that founding a colony was a form of divine mission, a way to bring order, gods, and culture to new lands. Temples and altars were among the first buildings constructed in these new settlements, reflecting the central role of religion in colonial life. As colonies flourished, they introduced new goods and ideas into the Greek world. Trade routes brought in grain from Egypt, tin from Britain, amber from the Baltic, and luxury goods from the Near East. This influx of foreign items helped inspire changes in Greek art and craftsmanship. Pottery styles, for example, began to reflect Eastern influences, with more detailed designs and new motifs. Greek sculptors started experimenting with new forms based on models seen in Egypt and Mesopotamia. The Archaic Age also saw the return of monumental architecture. Greek communities began building large stone temples dedicated to the gods. These early temples, such as the one at Thermon or the Heraion of Samos, were modest compared to later classical examples, but they marked a shift toward organized public religion and civic pride. At the same time, the Greeks began to formalize their systems of government. Most polis were controlled by aristocratic families, noble lineages that claimed descent from heroic ancestors. These elites controlled land, held military power, and dominated religious ceremonies. However, as trade and wealth grew, a new class of merchants and craftsmen emerged. These people had economic influence, but little political voice. Tensions between these groups led to frequent power struggles and, in some cases, the rise of tyrants. In Greek political language, a tyrant was not necessarily a cruel ruler. The word referred to someone who seized power outside of traditional aristocratic structures, often with popular support. In many cases, tyrants broke the hold of aristocratic families and implemented reforms that favored common citizens or merchants. Cypselus of Corinth and Theagenes of Megara are examples of early tyrants who challenged aristocratic privilege. While some tyrants became oppressive, others improved infrastructure, strengthened armies, and supported the arts. These political changes were deeply tied to the broader transformations of the Archaic Age. The rise of colonies, the growth of trade, and the increasing complexity of urban life all placed new pressures on traditional governance. The polis was evolving, not just as a political unit, but as a dynamic center of culture and identity. Another notable development of this era was the emergence of pan-Hellenic institutions, shared spaces and rituals that helped unify Greeks across city boundaries. The Olympic Games, first held in Olympia around the year 776 BCE, became a key example. These games were not just athletic competitions. They were religious festivals in honor of Zeus, bringing together Greeks from across the Mediterranean. Over time, other pan-Hellenic sanctuaries, such as Delphi and Nemea, also became places where city-states interacted in peace, even as they remained rivals elsewhere. These institutions helped foster a sense of common Hellenic identity, even as political unity remained elusive. Greeks began to see themselves as part of a broader cultural world, distinct from the so-called barbarians who did not speak their language or share their gods. This sense of shared identity would prove important in future conflicts, especially when facing foreign powers. As Greek city-states expanded in size, wealth, and complexity during the Archaic period, their internal political systems faced growing pressures. The foundations of the Polis had been laid, and colonization had pushed Greek culture outward. But within many city-states, rising tensions between elite families and the broader population began to strain the traditional order. The rigid grip of aristocratic clans over land, law, and leadership increasingly met resistance from new social forces: merchants, artisans, hoplite soldiers, and indebted farmers who demanded political recognition and protection. This climate of unrest opened the door to a series of political experiments, some of which altered the trajectory of Greek governance for centuries to come. The period between roughly the 7th and early 5th centuries BCE saw the emergence of two key responses to this pressure: the rise of tyrannies and the first attempts at formal constitutional reform. These responses varied across the Greek world, depending on local traditions and power structures, but together they marked a decisive shift away from inherited privilege and toward more inclusive political systems. Tyrannies appeared in many city-states during this era, not as systems of cruelty, but as responses to imbalance. In early Greek usage, a tyrannos was simply someone who gained power outside traditional hereditary structures, often with popular backing. These leaders typically came from aristocratic backgrounds themselves, but presented themselves as champions of the common people. By breaking the dominance of entrenched families, they temporarily offered stability, protection, and, in some cases, economic reform. In Corinth, for example, the rise of Cypselus in the mid-7th century BCE disrupted the rule of the Bacchiad clan, an aristocratic family that had monopolized political offices. According to tradition, Cypselus gained support from disaffected groups and used his position as polemarch, a military official, to seize control. His rule was followed by that of his son Periander, who maintained power through a combination of infrastructure development and tight control over opposition. Under these tyrants, Corinth became a wealthy and influential commercial center, noted for its pottery exports and efficient administration. Elsewhere, similar patterns emerged. In Sicyon, Cleisthenes expelled Dorian elites and realigned the city's tribal structure to favor his supporters. In Megara, Theagenes promised to redistribute land and improve conditions for the poor. While the details of these regimes vary, a common theme was the tyrant's attempt to secure legitimacy through public works, religious patronage, and military strength. Tyrannies were not long-lasting. Most lasted only a few generations before being overthrown or replaced by new forms of oligarchic rule. But their impact was significant. By weakening aristocratic monopolies and demonstrating alternative modes of governance, they set the stage for future reforms. In some places, tyrants were remembered as oppressive. In others, they were seen as necessary transitional figures during times of instability. Amidst these shifting power dynamics, certain city-states began to move toward codified laws and constitutional reform. The clearest example of this trend came from Athens, which over the course of 2 centuries transitioned from aristocratic dominance to the early stages of democratic governance. Athens in the 7th century BCE was governed by an aristocracy that controlled not only political offices, but also the interpretation of customary law. This created serious problems for poorer citizens, many of whom fell into debt and were subject to harsh penalties, including enslavement. Social unrest simmered. Economic grievances, coupled with the rising influence of the hoplite middle class, citizen soldiers who fought for the polis, led to increasing demands for legal transparency and structural change. In response, Athens appointed a man named Draco in the late 7th century to write down the laws. Draco's code was the first recorded attempt to formalize justice in Athens, but it became infamous for its severity. According to later sources, even minor offenses were punishable by death. While this code did not address the underlying causes of unrest, it marked a shift from oral tradition to written law. a critical step toward accountability. More significant reform came with Solon, an Athenian aristocrat and poet who was appointed as archon, chief magistrate, around the early 6th century BCE. Solon was given extraordinary powers to resolve the city's economic and political crisis. He approached the task with a combination of moderation and innovation, attempting to balance the interests of both elites and the poorer citizenry. Solon's most famous economic measure was the Sisaktheia, or shaking off of burdens, which canceled debts and ended debt slavery for Athenian citizens. This law restored personal freedom to many who had lost their land or liberty due to borrowing. Solon also restructured Athenian society into 4 property-based classes, determining political participation according to wealth rather than noble birth. The richest citizens could hold the highest offices, but all free male citizens could participate in the assembly and serve on juries. Solon introduced a council of 400, designed to prepare legislation for the broader assembly. He encouraged legal appeals and allowed any citizen to bring charges in court, not just the victim. These reforms opened public life to a broader segment of society and laid the groundwork for future democratic institutions. However, Solon's reforms did not please everyone. The wealthy resented the loss of their debt holdings, while the poor expected more radical redistribution. Solon, unwilling to become a tyrant or take sides, eventually withdrew from public life. Political strife returned. Factions formed around different interest groups, the coast, the plain, and the hills, each vying for influence. Into this climate stepped Pisistratus, a distant relative of Solon and a skilled military leader. Using a mix of populist rhetoric and strategic alliances, he seized power in Athens and became tyrant in the mid-6th century BCE. His rule, and that of his sons Hipparchus and Hippias, lasted several decades. While they ruled without constitutional legitimacy, they did not dismantle Solon's reforms. In fact, Pisistratus maintained the existing institutions and even expanded public works and patronized the arts. Under the Pisistratids, Athens flourished economically and culturally. The city saw major building projects, religious festivals grew in scale, and poetry and drama gained public support. But, after the assassination of Hipparchus and the increasingly harsh rule of Hippias, opposition grew. Eventually, a coalition led by Cleisthenes, backed by external forces from Sparta, expelled the tyrants and opened the door to a new phase in Athenian politics. Cleisthenes would go on to institute reforms that turned Athens into a more inclusive and participatory political system, what we now recognize as an early form of democracy. That transformation will be the focus of the next chapter. While many Greek city-states were experimenting with broader political participation, economic reform, and shifting power structures, one polis chose a path entirely its own. Sparta, located in the region of Laconia in the southeastern Peloponnese, developed a society unlike any other in the Greek world, rigid, militarized, and highly conservative. It was a city where the needs of the state came before personal ambition and where the citizen was first and foremost a soldier. Sparta's rise as a dominant power began in the early Archaic period, but its roots were shaped by earlier developments that responded to specific local challenges. Among these challenges was the conquest and control of Mycenaean, a fertile region to the west of Laconia. Sometime during the late 8th or early 7th century BCE, the Spartans launched a series of wars against the Mycenaeans and eventually subjugated them. The conquered population became Helots, a class of state-owned serfs who farmed the land and were compelled to hand over much of their produce to the Spartan state. This conquest created a permanent underclass that vastly outnumbered the Spartan citizens. The threat of revolt was ever present. The solution was not integration or negotiation. It was control through fear, discipline, and military readiness. Sparta remade itself as a militarized society designed to keep the Helot population suppressed and maintain internal cohesion. Central to this transformation was the Great Retra, a foundational code of laws and customs attributed to the semi-mythical figure Lycurgus. Whether Lycurgus was a real individual or a symbolic figure representing a gradual set of reforms is still debated, but the impact of the system he is said to have established is beyond question. The Great Retra was not a written constitution, but a set of oral traditions that structured every aspect of Spartan life, from education to governance. The Spartan political system was unique in its combination of monarchy, oligarchy, and limited popular elements. It was ruled by two kings, drawn from separate royal families, the Agiads and the Eurypontids. These kings shared power and commanded the military, but their authority was checked by other institutions. The Gerousia, or Council of Elders, included the kings and 28 other men over the age of 60, chosen for life. They prepared laws and acted as a high court. The Apella, or assembly of male citizens, could vote on proposals but had no right to debate them. More powerful was the Ephorate, a body of 5 annually elected officials known as ephors. The ephors could summon and preside over the kings, supervise public education, and even bring charges against the monarchy. This complex balance of power ensured that no single individual could dominate the system. But what truly set Sparta apart was not its political structure, but its approach to social organization. The entire male citizen population was expected to serve in the military. From the age of 7, Spartan boys entered the agoge, a state-run education and training system designed to produce disciplined and obedient soldiers. The agoge emphasized physical endurance, communal living, loyalty to the group, and strict hierarchy. Boys were taught to endure hardship, speak briefly and precisely, and suppress emotion. Those who excelled could advance to leadership roles. Those who failed were marginalized or excluded. Upon reaching adulthood, Spartan men became full citizens, known as Spartiates, but only if they completed their training and were accepted into a communal mess group, known as a syssician. Citizenship was tied to participation in these messes, which reinforced social bonds and group identity. Even as adults, Spartan men lived together in barracks and dined in common until they were well into middle age. Women in Sparta had a different role compared to their counterparts elsewhere in Greece. They were not secluded or politically active, but they enjoyed a degree of independence and respect uncommon in the Greek world. Spartan women managed estates, received physical education, and were expected to produce strong and healthy children. Their primary role was to uphold Spartan values and give birth to future warriors. As one Spartan mother was reputed to have said when handing her son a shield, "Return with it or on it." The result of this system was a society that prioritized discipline, unity, and martial excellence above all else. Wealth was not accumulated through trade or craftsmanship. Sparta discouraged commerce, luxury, and even travel. Coinage was made of heavy iron to deter hoarding or economic manipulation. Individual ambition was suppressed in favor of collective success. Honor came through obedience and performance on the battlefield, not through wealth or rhetoric. Despite its insular nature, Sparta became one of the most respected and feared city-states in Greece. Its army, composed of hoplite infantry trained from childhood, was considered nearly unbeatable in open land battles. The strict discipline and cohesion of the Spartan phalanx made it the gold standard of military power in the Greek world for generations. Sparta's control over its Helot population, however, remained a constant source of tension. Helots were periodically subjected to terror and intimidation campaigns. One of the most notorious practices was the Krypteia, a secret police operation in which select young Spartans were sent out to kill Helots who were seen as threats or had shown signs of defiance. This brutal tactic was designed to prevent uprisings but also revealed the deep insecurity beneath the Spartan system. By the 6th century BCE, Sparta began to assert its influence beyond Laconia. It formed alliances with other Peloponnesian city-states, gradually building what historians call the Peloponnesian League, a coalition that included Corinth, Elis, and other regional powers. Unlike an empire, the League was a military alliance in which Sparta acted as the hegemon. Member states retained their autonomy but were expected to follow Sparta's lead in matters of war and diplomacy. While Sparta rarely intervened in the internal politics of other polis, it positioned itself as a defender of traditional aristocratic values. In later centuries, it would oppose the spread of democracy and support oligarchic regimes throughout the Greek world. Sparta's conservatism and reluctance to embrace change earned it both admiration and criticism. At the turn of the 6th century BCE, the city of Athens stood at a crossroads. It had endured aristocratic dominance, periods of tyranny, and episodes of civil unrest. Its economy had grown, its population expanded, and new classes of citizens had emerged demanding recognition. But unlike Sparta, which tightened control to maintain its rigid order, Athens moved in the opposite direction. It opened its political system, and in doing so, it laid the foundation for one of the most influential ideas in world history: democracy. This transformation did not happen suddenly, nor was it the result of any one man's vision. Rather, it came through decades of struggle, reform, and experimentation. Still, a key turning point arrived in the year 508 BCE, when an aristocrat named Cleisthenes introduced a series of reforms that restructured Athenian society and created new institutions that would become the basis of democratic governance. Before Cleisthenes, Athens had been dominated by aristocratic families organized into traditional clans and tribes. These families controlled political offices, priesthoods, and legal privileges. Even earlier reforms, such as those introduced by Solon, had failed to fully break their grip. After the fall of the Pseudostratid tyranny, a power struggle emerged between rival noble families, most notably Cleisthenes and Isagoras. When Isagoras attempted to seize control with support from the Spartan king Cleomenes, he tried to dissolve the popular assembly and exile hundreds of citizens. The people of Athens responded with force. They rose up, expelled Isagoras and his Spartan backers, and turned to Cleisthenes for leadership. What followed was not just a shift in power, but a transformation of the political order itself. Cleisthenes began by dismantling the old tribal structure. Instead of basing political identity on family ties, he divided the population into dems, or local districts. These dems became the basic units of political organization. Every citizen was enrolled in a dem, regardless of noble lineage or wealth. He then grouped the dems into 10 new tribes, each made up of people from different parts of the city and countryside. This was a deliberate attempt to break the influence of regional aristocracies. By mixing citizens from diverse backgrounds, Cleisthenes forced collaboration across class and geography. It was a foundational move toward equality among citizens, not in wealth or status, but in political participation. Next came the creation of the Council of 500, known as the Boule. This council replaced the earlier body of 400, established by Solon. Each of the 10 new tribes selected 50 members by lot to serve on the council for a year. The Boule prepared legislation, oversaw public administration, and coordinated the work of various magistrates. The use of random selection was revolutionary. It ensured that ordinary citizens, not just the elite, could participate in governing the city. Alongside the council stood the assembly, or ecclesia, which had existed in earlier forms, but gained new power under Cleisthenes' reforms. Open to all male citizens, the assembly became the principal legislative body. It debated proposals, passed laws, and made decisions on war, alliances, and other public matters. Participation was not mandatory, but attendance was encouraged, and later incentives were introduced to support poorer citizens who could not afford to take time off from work. Another significant innovation was the introduction of ostracism. Each year, citizens could vote to exile a fellow citizen for 10 years if they believed he posed a threat to the state. This was not a criminal punishment, but a political safeguard. It was designed to prevent the rise of tyrants or overly ambitious individuals. The process was open and collective. Citizens scratched names onto shards of pottery called ostraca, and the person with the most votes was exiled. Ostracism reflected both the democratic spirit and the ever-present anxiety about concentrated power. The system created by Cleisthenes did not yet include full democracy as we understand it today. Women, slaves, and foreigners remained excluded. Political offices were still dominated by wealthier citizens, and there was no secret ballot or universal suffrage. However, what made the Athenian model so significant was its direction. It moved power outward, from the few to the many, and grounded legitimacy in the collective decisions of ordinary citizens. Cleisthenes' reforms also shifted how Athenians understood their identity. Previously, one's political role was tied to noble heritage or regional loyalty. Now, being a citizen of Athens, regardless of background, carried meaning. It meant having a voice in public affairs and a responsibility to the city. This emerging sense of civic identity helped unify a diverse and sometimes fractious population. Over the next decades, Athens would refine and expand its democratic institutions. The role of juries grew, and citizen courts became a powerful tool of accountability. Magistrates were chosen by lot rather than election, reinforcing the principle of equal opportunity. The military was also democratized through the organization of tribal regiments and the election of strategoi, or generals, who were selected one from each tribe. These developments had practical as well as ideological importance. Athens needed political stability to support its growing economy, expanding trade, and strategic position in the Aegean. By creating avenues for citizen participation, it reduced the risk of civil strife and brought new energy into public life. Athens was not the only city experimenting with broader participation, but it pushed the concept further than any other Greek polis. Its democratic system evolved over time, adapting to new challenges and incorporating more citizens into its mechanisms. Critics existed, of course. Some believed democracy gave too much power to the uninformed or encouraged mob rule. Philosophers like Plato would later argue that democracy was inherently unstable. Yet the Athenian experiment endured and inspired, shaping the thinking of later generations in the Greek world and beyond. In the final years of the 6th century BCE, a conflict emerged that would transform the Greek world from a patchwork of rival city-states into a unified cultural force. This conflict was not driven by internal power struggles or ideological disputes. It was sparked by an encounter with an empire, vast, foreign, and seemingly unstoppable. The Persian Wars, fought between the Greek city-states and the Achaemenid Persian Empire, would become one of the defining moments in ancient history. It was during this struggle that the idea of Greek freedom was born, not as a philosophical abstraction, but as a political reality defended on the battlefield. The origins of the war can be traced to the Ionian coast of Asia Minor, where Greek-speaking cities had flourished for centuries. These cities, including Miletus, Ephesus, and Sardis, had developed rich economies and vibrant cultures. However, by the late 6th century, they had fallen under the control of the Persian Empire, which had expanded rapidly under Cyrus the Great, Cambyses, and Darius I. The Persians tolerated local traditions, but demanded tribute and obedience. In some cases, Persian-appointed tyrants ruled the cities directly. In the year 499 BCE, a revolt broke out in Ionia. Led by Aristogoras of Miletus, the Ionian revolt began as a local uprising but quickly drew support from mainland Greece. Athens and Eretria sent ships and soldiers to aid the rebels. Together, the Greek forces attacked and burned the Persian provincial capital of Sardis. This act of aggression enraged Darius I, who vowed to punish the Greeks, especially the Athenians, for their interference. Though the Ionian revolt was eventually crushed by Persian forces, it had far-reaching consequences. It revealed both the vulnerability of Persian control in the West and the potential of Greek resistance when coordinated. More importantly, it drew the attention of the Persian Empire across the Aegean Sea. In the year 490 BCE, Darius launched the first major Persian invasion of mainland Greece. His fleet, carrying soldiers and cavalry, sailed toward Attica, targeting Athens directly. The Athenians, outnumbered and under immense pressure, turned to their army of citizen soldiers, the hoplites, for defense. The decisive confrontation took place at Marathon, a coastal plain northeast of Athens. The Athenian general Miltiades took advantage of the terrain and the discipline of the hoplite phalanx. Against all expectations, the Athenian forces routed the Persians, who fled to their ships. The victory at Marathon was not just a military success. It was a psychological turning point. It showed that a relatively small, citizen-led force could defeat a professional imperial army. According to later tradition, a messenger named Phidippides ran from Marathon to Athens to announce the victory, inspiring the modern concept of the marathon race. While this story may be more symbolic than historical, the impact of the battle was real. Athens gained prestige, confidence, and a new sense of civic identity tied to military service and defense of freedom. But the conflict was far from over. In the years that followed, both sides prepared for a larger confrontation. In Persia, Xerxes, the son of Darius, began assembling one of the largest armies the world had ever seen. In Greece, the threat forced city-states to reconsider their rivalries and form new alliances. Leadership in this moment fell to two cities, Athens and Sparta. Though very different in political culture and social structure, they recognized the need for cooperation. A number of Greek city-states formed the Hellenic League, a defensive coalition that coordinated strategy and resources. Sparta was chosen to lead the land forces, while Athens took command of the navy. In the year 480 BCE, Xerxes launched his invasion. His army crossed the Hellespont on a massive pontoon bridge and marched south through Thrace and Macedonia. The scale of the invasion was unprecedented. Ancient sources speak of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, though modern historians suggest smaller but still massive numbers. The first major land engagement occurred at Thermopylae, a narrow pass in central Greece. A small Greek force, led by the Spartan king Leonidas, was sent to delay the Persians while the rest of the Hellenic League prepared. Though vastly outnumbered, the Greeks held the pass for several days. Leonidas and his personal guard of 300 Spartans, along with several thousand other allies, made a final stand after being betrayed by a local who revealed a secret path to the Persians. Thermopylae became a symbol of sacrifice and resistance. The Spartans were annihilated, but their delay allowed the Greek forces to regroup. At sea, a simultaneous battle at Artemisium resulted in a tactical stalemate, but the Greek navy began to prove its importance. After Thermopylae, the Persian army advanced into central Greece, capturing and burning Athens. Many Athenians had already evacuated, and the city was largely abandoned. But the strategic situation was not hopeless. Themistocles, an Athenian politician and naval commander, had earlier persuaded his city to invest in a massive fleet of triremes, sleek, fast warships powered by rows of oarsmen. It was this fleet that would play a decisive role in the next stage of the war. The final confrontation came at Salamis, a narrow strait near Athens. Themistocles lured the Persian fleet into the cramped waters, where their numerical advantage was neutralized. The Greek triremes, more maneuverable and better coordinated, rammed and sank many Persian ships. The victory at Salamis forced Xerxes to retreat with most of his forces, leaving behind a smaller army under his general Mardonius. The following year, in 479 BCE, the remaining Persian troops were defeated at the Battle of Plataea, led by a Spartan force under Pausanias. On the same day, according to tradition, the Greek navy also won a decisive victory at Mycenaean, on the coast of Asia Minor. With these twin defeats, the immediate threat from Persia was ended. The Persian army withdrew, and the Greek city-states remained free. The Persian Wars had profound consequences. Militarily, they demonstrated the effectiveness of the hoplite phalanx and the trireme navy. Politically, they reinforced the value of collective action and interpolis cooperation. Culturally, they deepened a shared Greek identity, forged not by language or heritage alone, but by the experience of common struggle. Athens emerged from the conflict transformed. Its leadership in the naval campaign and its rebuilding efforts after the Persian sack elevated its standing among the Greeks. The city would soon take the lead in a new alliance, the Delian League, that would grow into a maritime empire. Sparta, too, retained its prestige as the heroic defender at Thermopylae and leader of the final land campaigns. With the Persian invasions repelled and the Greek mainland secure, the aftermath of the wars revealed a new power dynamic in the Aegean world. While Sparta returned to its traditionally cautious and insular policies, Athens emerged from the conflict energized, ambitious, and increasingly dominant at sea. It was from this position of strength that Athens began to construct what would become the Athenian Empire, beginning with the formation of a coalition known as the Delian League. The Delian League was established around the year 478 BCE, shortly after the victories at Plataea and Mycale. It was created as a military alliance of Greek city-states, aimed at deterring further Persian aggression and liberating Greek communities still under Persian control, particularly in Asia Minor and the eastern Aegean islands. The league was led by Athens, whose naval power had proven essential in the earlier victories. The name Delian League came from the island of Delos, where the league's treasury was originally housed and where member states sent representatives to deliberate. Delos, sacred to Apollo, symbolized unity and neutrality. Each member city contributed either ships and men or, more commonly over time, financial tribute used to maintain the fleet. This funding allowed Athens to build and expand its navy, which became the largest and most advanced in the Greek world. At first, the league operated as a cooperative effort, with Athens as a primus inter pares, first among equals. Member states had a voice in decisions, and the focus remained on the common cause of fighting Persia. Several successful campaigns were launched, including the liberation of cities in Thrace and the capture of key Persian bases such as Ion and Sestos. However, as the Persian threat receded, the nature of the league began to shift. Many member states found it more convenient to send money rather than maintain their own ships. This gradually allowed Athens to centralize naval control. The Athenian fleet, manned by its own citizens and rowers, became the enforcement arm of the league. Athens also began stationing garrisons in other cities, installing friendly governments, and intervening in local disputes. Actions that increasingly resembled imperial oversight rather than alliance leadership. The turning point came when member states began attempting to leave the league. One of the earliest examples was Naxos, which tried to withdraw but was forcibly subdued and brought back into the league by force. Later, Thasos, a wealthy island with important gold mines, also revolted. Athens responded by besieging the city, stripping it of its defenses and taking control of its resources. These actions marked a clear departure from voluntary alliance to enforced subordination. The treasury of the league, originally located on Delos, was eventually moved to Athens itself around the year 454 BCE. This move was justified by Athens on the grounds of protecting the funds from Persian attack, but it also signified a shift in control. The funds collected from other city-states now directly financed Athenian construction projects, festivals, and military campaigns. What had been a mutual defense pact was now a financial engine for Athenian ambitions. Athens used its growing wealth to transform the city itself. Under the leadership of Pericles, a prominent statesman and orator, the city underwent a period of extraordinary architectural and cultural development. The Acropolis was rebuilt, including the construction of the Parthenon, a temple to Athena that symbolized the city's power and refinement. Public spaces, theaters, and government buildings were improved. Athenians were paid for jury service and other civic duties, broadening participation in the democratic process. This cultural flourishing, known as the Golden Age of Athens, was funded largely by the tribute of the Delian League. The Athenian populace benefited directly from the empire's resources, while Athens itself became the intellectual and artistic capital of the Greek world. Philosophers, playwrights, historians, and sculptors found support and audience in a society that saw itself as the leader of Greek civilization. But not all Greeks viewed Athenian power so favorably. For many, especially those in subject cities, Athens had become an empire in all but name. Tribute payments were mandatory, disobedience was punished, and Athenian interests often took precedence over local autonomy. In some cases, Athens imposed kleroukes, colonies of Athenian citizens settled in allied or subject territories. These settlers retained Athenian citizenship and often controlled the best lands, reinforcing the city's influence abroad. The rise of Athenian naval power also created a strategic imbalance. While Sparta remained dominant on land, Athens now controlled the seas. Its navy ensured not only military security but also commercial dominance. Athenian ships protected trade routes, and the city became a hub for grain, silver, pottery, and other goods. The harbor of Piraeus, once a modest port, expanded into a thriving economic center. This growing disparity fueled tension between Athens and Sparta. Although both cities had cooperated during the Persian Wars, their political values and strategic interests were increasingly at odds. Athens championed democracy, naval supremacy, and economic expansion. Sparta defended oligarchy, military conservatism, and regional control of the Peloponnese. Their respective allies often mirrored these divisions, forming blocs that competed for influence across the Greek world. One of the more visible signs of this tension was the creation of the Long Walls, fortifications built by Athens to connect the city with its port at Piraeus. These walls ensured that even during siege, Athens could receive supplies by sea and maintain its economy. The construction of the walls was viewed with suspicion by Sparta and its allies, who feared that Athens was preparing for long-term military confrontation. Throughout the mid-5th century BCE, conflicts and proxy wars flared between Athenian and Spartan allies. Athens clashed with Corinth, a key Spartan ally, in disputes over colonies and trade routes. In Boeotia, Thessaly, and the Aegean Islands, shifting alliances and military interventions kept tensions high. Athens also attempted to expand its influence on the mainland. Under Pericles, the city sent expeditions into central Greece and supported democratic factions in rival city-states. Though some of these ventures were successful, others backfired, such as the failed campaign in Egypt against Persian forces, which weakened Athenian resources and morale. With the Persian threat receding and the Delian League transforming into an empire under its control, Athens entered a period of unparalleled cultural achievement and civic confidence. This era, which spanned much of the 5th century BCE, is often referred to as the Golden Age of Athens. During this time, the city became a beacon of philosophy, drama, architecture, and historical inquiry. Yet behind its cultural brilliance lay complex political dynamics and growing social tensions that would eventually test the foundations of Athenian democracy. At the center of this flourishing stood Pericles, a prominent statesman, general, and orator whose leadership helped shape the political and artistic direction of the city. Though Athens had no formal office of head of state, Pericles exercised lasting influence through repeated election as strategos, or general, and through his persuasive role in the assembly. He advocated for Athenian supremacy in the Greek world, encouraged civic participation among citizens, and oversaw ambitious building projects that symbolized Athens' power. One of Pericles' most iconic undertakings was the reconstruction of the Acropolis, the hilltop sanctuary that had been destroyed during the Persian invasions. Under his direction, Athens launched a vast public works program, funded largely by tribute from its empire. The most famous result of this initiative was the Parthenon, a temple dedicated to Athena Parthenos, the city's patron deity. Designed by the architects Ictinus and Callicrates and adorned with sculpture by Phidias, the Parthenon represented both religious devotion and civic pride. This period also witnessed an explosion of intellectual activity. Philosophers, scientists, and artists gathered in Athens to explore questions of ethics, politics, mathematics, and the nature of the universe. Anaxagoras, a thinker from Ionia, introduced the idea that celestial bodies were made of matter and could be understood through reason. His teachings, controversial at the time, influenced younger Athenians, including Pericles himself. The figure who would later define Greek philosophy, Socrates, was also active in Athens during this era. Though he left no writings of his own, his method of dialogue and relentless questioning challenged assumptions about knowledge, justice, and virtue. Socrates' insistence on rational inquiry, even in the face of political disapproval, would leave a lasting mark on Western thought, transmitted through the works of his student Plato and Plato's student Aristotle. In literature, Athens became the center of dramatic innovation. The theater of Dionysus, located on the south slope of the Acropolis, hosted performances of both tragedy and comedy. These plays were more than entertainment. They served as public forums for exploring the tensions of war, justice, fate, and human character. Playwrights such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides developed complex narratives that reflected on contemporary issues. Aeschylus's Oresteia explored themes of vengeance and law. Sophocles' Antigone posed difficult questions about obedience and conscience. Euripides challenged traditional values with controversial portrayals of gods and heroes. Comedy, too, played a role in political life. Aristophanes, the master of old comedy, used satire to critique public figures and policies. His play The Clouds, for example, lampooned Socratic philosophy and the changing values of Athenian society. This cultural efflorescence was underpinned by Athens' economic prosperity. The city thrived on maritime trade, and its port at Piraeus became one of the busiest in the Mediterranean. Shipbuilding, ceramics, silver mining, and slave labor all contributed to its wealth. Athenian coinage, stamped with the image of Athena and her sacred owl, circulated widely and symbolized the city's commercial influence. Civic life was equally active. The assembly met regularly, allowing male citizens to debate and vote on matters ranging from war to public festivals. Law courts, staffed by large juries selected by lot, adjudicated disputes and held public officials accountable. Pericles introduced reforms that paid citizens for jury service, enabling even the poor to participate in governance. This broadened political access and reinforced the idea that citizenship required active engagement. Yet not all segments of society shared equally in this golden age. Women, though essential to religious life and domestic management, were excluded from formal political participation. Most remained confined to the household and lacked legal autonomy. Foreigners, or metics, contributed to the economy but held no political rights. Slavery remained an entrenched institution. Many Athenians owned slaves who worked in homes, workshops, and mines. Despite these inequalities, the Athenians saw themselves as a free people. Freedom, in their view, did not mean individual autonomy in the modern sense, but participation in a collective political life. To be free was to have a voice in the decisions that shaped one's community. The sense of Athenian exceptionalism grew alongside its empire. Pericles famously declared that Athens was the school of Hellas, a city where the talents of individuals were nurtured for the benefit of the whole. In his funeral oration, delivered during the early years of the Peloponnesian War, he praised the city's democratic institutions, military valor, and cultural achievements. His words, preserved by Thucydides, became one of the most enduring statements of civic pride in the ancient world. But the very success of Athens also sowed the seeds of conflict. The wealth and tribute flowing into the city fostered resentment among its allies. Its naval dominance threatened rival powers. Its political model, admired by some, was viewed with suspicion by others. The use of imperial resources to fund local projects, such as the Parthenon, was seen by many as an abuse of power. Athens, in the minds of some Greeks, had ceased to be a leader and had become a master. Discontent simmered in subject cities, and alliances began to shift. Sparta, long wary of Athenian expansion, viewed its growing influence as a direct challenge to the Peloponnesian League and the traditional order of the Greek world. Meanwhile, internal tensions were also rising. The democratic system, while inclusive in principle, was vulnerable to demagoguery and factionalism. As debates grew more polarized and foreign conflicts more frequent, the assembly sometimes acted impulsively or harshly. Dissenting voices, even those of intellectuals and artists, could be met with suspicion. By the close of the 5th century BCE, the balance of power in the Greek world had become increasingly fragile. Athens, wealthy from its empire and confident in its democratic institutions, stood at the peak of its influence. Sparta, wary of Athenian ambitions and committed to preserving its traditional order, viewed this rise with growing alarm. Tensions that had smoldered for decades finally ignited into open conflict. What followed was not a quick war between two leading city-states, but a long, exhausting struggle that fractured the Greek world, politically, economically, and morally. This was the Peloponnesian War. The immediate causes of the war were rooted in a series of disputes involving Athenian interference in the affairs of Sparta's allies. One of the key flashpoints occurred in Corcyra, modern Corfu, a colony of Corinth that sought Athenian support in a conflict against its mother city. Athens agreed to assist, angering Corinth, a major Spartan ally. In another case, Athens imposed harsh economic sanctions on Megara, barring its merchants from Athenian markets and ports. Megara was also aligned with Sparta, and the sanction was perceived as both provocative and punitive. Sparta, after years of watching Athens expand its empire and influence, declared that Athens had violated the peace established after earlier skirmishes. In the year 431 BCE, Sparta and its allies declared war, beginning what would become a protracted conflict that engulfed much of the Greek world. The war is typically divided into three main phases: the Archaic War, the Sicilian expedition, and the Ionian or Decelean War. Each phase reveals different aspects of the conflict and how it reshaped Greek politics and society. The first phase, known as the Archaic War, named after the Spartan king Archidamus II, lasted from the outbreak of war to around the signing of a temporary peace in 421 BCE. This period saw annual invasions of Athenian territory by Spartan forces who ravaged the countryside in hopes of drawing out the Athenian army. However, Athens, under the strategic guidance of Pericles, refused to engage the Spartans on land. Instead, the Athenians withdrew behind their long walls, relying on their navy to conduct raids and maintain supply lines by sea. This strategy, while effective militarily, placed severe strain on the population. Thousands crowded within the city walls, creating cramped and unsanitary conditions. In the second year of the war, a devastating plague struck Athens. The disease spread rapidly through the densely packed population, killing a significant portion of the citizenry. Among the victims was Pericles himself, whose death left a leadership vacuum and deepened internal divisions. Despite the disaster, Athens continued to wage war at sea, achieving notable victories, including the capture of Spartan territory on the island of Sphacteria. The unexpected surrender of Spartan hoplites at Sphacteria shocked the Greek world and briefly tilted the war in Athens' favor. However, the balance remained unstable, and both sides sought periods of negotiation. In the year 421 BCE, a temporary truce known as the Peace of Nicias was agreed upon. Named after the Athenian general Nicias, the treaty was intended to last for 50 years, though few expected it to endure. Almost immediately, hostilities resumed in various parts of the Greek world, as allies of both powers continued to fight over influence and territory. The second phase of the war brought a dramatic and disastrous shift for Athens. Encouraged by a new generation of ambitious leaders, especially Alcibiades, Athens launched a massive military expedition against the island of Sicily, targeting the powerful city of Syracuse. The rationale for the Sicilian expedition, launched in 415 BCE, was that controlling Sicily would grant Athens access to vast resources and open new opportunities for expansion. The expedition was plagued by poor planning, divided leadership, and bad luck from the start. Alcibiades, one of its original commanders, was recalled to face charges of impiety but defected to Sparta instead. He advised the Spartans on how best to counter the Athenian campaign. Meanwhile, Nicias, who had opposed the expedition from the beginning, found himself in command of a massive force he never wanted to lead. The campaign ended in catastrophe. The Athenians failed to take Syracuse and became trapped by a reinforced and determined enemy. A final attempt to retreat by sea was blocked, and the Athenian fleet was destroyed. Thousands of soldiers were captured and forced to work in stone quarries under brutal conditions. Few ever returned home. This defeat shattered Athenian confidence and weakened its military capabilities. It also emboldened Sparta, which now received support from the Persian Empire, eager to see Athens humbled. The final phase of the war, sometimes called the Ionian or Decelean War, saw Sparta establish a permanent base in Decilia, just north of Athens. This allowed the Spartans to disrupt Athenian land routes and draw off slaves and resources from the countryside. At sea, the balance of power also began to shift. With Persian funding, Sparta was able to build a fleet that could challenge Athenian dominance. Naval battles in the Hellespont and the Aegean became increasingly costly for Athens, both in manpower and morale. The war, by this point, was not simply a contest between two powers. It had become a struggle for survival. Athens faced internal strife as well. Political instability grew. Democratic institutions were temporarily overthrown in favor of oligarchic councils, only to be later restored. Leaders such as Alcibiades, who had returned to Athens after switching allegiances multiple times, were both admired and distrusted. The political climate was turbulent, and the people were divided. The final blow came at the Battle of Aegospotami in 405 BCE, where the Spartan commander Lysander caught the Athenian fleet by surprise and destroyed it. Without a navy, Athens could no longer supply itself or defend its empire. In 404 BCE, Athens surrendered. Its long walls were torn down, its fleet dismantled, and a short-lived oligarchic government, the so-called 30 Tyrants, was installed with Spartan backing. The Peloponnesian War had ended, but the cost was staggering. Athens, once the proud leader of the Greek world, was left exhausted and humiliated. Sparta, though victorious, emerged overstretched and faced new challenges in managing its dominance. The Greek world was left divided and weakened, its resources depleted, its alliances unstable. The war had also transformed how Greeks understood politics, power, and justice. The historian Thucydides, himself a veteran of the conflict, chronicled the war with a depth and realism unmatched in ancient historiography. He focused not on divine intervention or myth, but on human decision-making, ambition, fear, and chance. His work remains one of the most important historical accounts of warfare and political decline. In the year following Athens' defeat in the Peloponnesian War, Sparta stood at the pinnacle of its power. For over a century, the city had pursued a policy of military conservatism and isolation. Now, having dismantled the Athenian Empire, it emerged as the dominant power in Greece. But this supremacy would prove short-lived. The very forces that enabled Sparta's rise, military discipline, alliance networks, and political conservatism, would soon become liabilities in a rapidly changing world. Within a generation, Sparta would find itself isolated, resented, and ultimately defeated by forces it could neither fully understand nor effectively counter. In the immediate aftermath of victory, Sparta attempted to reshape the Greek world according to its own ideals. Athenian democracy was dismantled and replaced with an oligarchic council known as the 30 Tyrants, led by Critias and other anti-democratic figures with Spartan support. The regime, backed by a Spartan garrison, ruled with brutality, executing or exiling hundreds of citizens. Though intended to prevent a revival of Athenian power, the tyranny proved too harsh even for some Spartan allies. Within a year, the Athenian Democrats, led by Thrasybulus, rose in revolt and overthrew the 30. Remarkably, Sparta did not intervene militarily to restore its allies, signaling the beginning of internal divisions within the Spartan leadership. Elsewhere in the Greek world, Sparta imposed oligarchic governments loyal to its interests and placed harmosts, military governors, in key cities. The idea was to maintain order and loyalty, but this approach bred resentment. Many former allies of Sparta, who had joined the Peloponnesian League under the banner of resisting Athenian domination, now found themselves subject to similar treatment from their supposed liberators. One major flashpoint was Corinth, whose ambitions conflicted with Sparta's desire to dictate the terms of post-war reconstruction. Another was Thebes, a city with a long history of rivalry with Athens and an uneasy relationship with Sparta. Thebes had expected rewards for its support during the war, but found itself sidelined in the new power arrangement. Dissatisfaction grew, and alliances began to shift. The Spartan general Lysander, hailed as a hero for his victories during the war, initially wielded enormous influence. He played a leading role in the imposition of pro-Spartan regimes across the Aegean and even attempted to extend his personal power within Sparta itself. However, his growing ambition alarmed the more traditional elements of Spartan society, including the royal family and conservative elders. Eventually, his authority was curtailed, and internal divisions within Sparta became more visible. At the same time, Sparta began to overextend its resources. Its army, though elite, was small and heavily reliant on the rigid social system that had defined Spartan life for centuries. That system was under increasing strain. The number of full Spartan citizens, those who completed the agage and contributed to the communal messes, had been declining for generations. War casualties, economic inequality, and a reluctance to expand citizenship left Sparta dangerously underpopulated. Facing mounting hostility, Sparta became embroiled in a new conflict known as the Corinthian War, which lasted from roughly the early 390s to the mid-380s BCE. This war pitted Sparta against a coalition that included Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and Argos, many of the same powers it had fought during the Peloponnesian War. What made this conflict especially difficult for Sparta was the support these cities received from the Persian Empire, which now saw Sparta as the greater threat to its interests in Asia Minor. Persian gold funded the rebuilding of the Athenian fleet and enabled new military campaigns against Spartan outposts. One of the key battles of the war was the naval confrontation at Cnidus, where the Spartan fleet was decisively defeated. This loss shattered Sparta's naval ambitions and cut off its influence in the eastern Aegean. Realizing the limits of its power, Sparta eventually accepted a negotiated peace known as the King's Peace, or the Peace of Antalcidas, brokered by the Persian king Artaxerxes. This treaty, agreed upon in the early 380s BCE, declared that all Greek cities in Asia Minor would remain under Persian control, while other Greek cities were to remain autonomous. Though it secured peace for a time, it also marked a clear reversal in Spartan policy and a loss of face. The so-called liberator of Greece had now openly accepted Persian authority over Greek cities in Asia. Meanwhile, in mainland Greece, tensions continued to build. Sparta, increasingly viewed as an occupying force, continued to enforce its dominance through garrisons and political pressure. In Mantinea, a city in the Peloponnese, Sparta intervened to dismantle its fortifications and dissolve its democratic government. In Thebes, Sparta occupied the Cadmea, the city's central citadel, installing a puppet regime and suppressing opposition. But opposition was far from extinguished. In the year 379 BCE, a group of exiled Theban democrats secretly returned and staged a daring coup to retake their city. With Athenian support, they expelled the Spartan garrison and restored Theban independence. This event would mark the beginning of a dramatic reversal in Greek politics. Thebes began to rise as a new military and political power. Under the leadership of Epaminondas and Pelopidas, Thebes reformed its army, established alliances, and began to challenge Spartan supremacy. The turning point came in the year 371 BCE at the Battle of Leuctra. At Leuctra, Epaminondas employed innovative tactics that broke the traditional symmetry of the hoplite phalanx. He concentrated his forces on one wing, creating a dense, powerful column that overwhelmed the elite Spartan units. The Spartan king Cleombrotus was killed in battle, and the myth of Spartan invincibility on land was shattered. This defeat marked a profound change in the Greek world. For centuries, Sparta had been feared and respected for its disciplined army and unwavering order. Now it had been decisively defeated by a city once considered second tier. The impact was not just military but psychological. The aura of Spartan dominance dissolved, and new possibilities emerged for the structure of Greek power. In the years that followed, Thebes would expand its influence across central Greece and the Peloponnese, establishing a short-lived hegemony. Sparta, meanwhile, would never fully recover. Its citizen population continued to dwindle, its economy remained inflexible, and its reputation no longer held the power it once did. With the decline of Spartan dominance in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, the Greek world entered a period of instability and shifting allegiances. While Sparta remained a significant military presence, its aura of invincibility had been weakened. Into this vacuum stepped a city that had often been overshadowed by its more famous neighbors, Thebes. For much of the classical period, Thebes had played a supporting role in the affairs of mainland Greece. But in the 4th century BCE, Thebes redefined its place in the Hellenic world, culminating in a decisive confrontation that would reshape Greek power, the Battle of Leuctra. The path to Theban ascendancy began with the expulsion of the Spartan garrison from the Cadmea, Thebes's central fortress, in the year 379 BCE. This bold move, orchestrated by a group of exiled patriots and supported covertly by Athens, signaled the beginning of a new era. The successful uprising restored Theban autonomy and gave rise to a wave of political and military reforms that would soon position the city at the forefront of Greek affairs. Key to Thebes's transformation was the emergence of two visionary leaders, Epaminondas and Pelopidas. Both were aristocrats by birth but committed to civic reform and military innovation. Pelopidas led the formation of the Sacred Band, an elite corps composed of 150 pairs of male lovers. The idea behind this unit was both strategic and cultural. Men who fought alongside their beloved were believed to exhibit exceptional bravery and loyalty. The Sacred Band would later play a crucial role in Theban victories. Epaminondas, meanwhile, was a philosopher general known for his intelligence, moral integrity, and tactical brilliance. He envisioned a new role for Thebes, not simply as a regional power, but as a leader capable of checking both Spartan aggression and Athenian ambition. To achieve this, he focused on restructuring the Theban army and building alliances throughout central and northern Greece. By the early 370s BCE, Thebes had become the leader of a revitalized Boeotian League, a federation of cities in central Greece with Thebes at its head. Sparta, alarmed by Theban assertiveness, attempted to reassert control over the region. In response, tensions escalated, and open conflict became inevitable. The decisive encounter came in the summer of 371 BCE near the town of Leuctra, located in the southwestern part of Boeotia. The Spartan army, led by King Cleombrotus, marched north with the intention of crushing Theban resistance and restoring Spartan authority. The force included contingents from several allied cities, reflecting Sparta's continued influence. The Theban army, smaller in number and less well-resourced, met the Spartans on open ground. However, Epaminondas had prepared an unorthodox strategy that would challenge the traditional conventions of Greek warfare. Until that point, hoplite battles were typically fought with evenly distributed phalanxes, where strength was balanced across the front line. Victory often depended on the cohesion and discipline of the formation. Epaminondas broke this symmetry. He concentrated his best troops, including the Sacred Band, on the left wing of the Theban line and arranged them in an unusually deep formation, up to 50 ranks thick. This dense column was positioned directly opposite the elite Spartan right wing, traditionally the strongest part of any phalanx. On the Theban right, he deployed lighter forces in looser formation to delay the less threatening sections of the Spartan line. The effect of this maneuver was dramatic. When the battle commenced, the Theban left surged forward with overwhelming force, crashing into the Spartans and disrupting their cohesion. The sheer depth of the formation gave it momentum and staying power, while the element of surprise caught the Spartans off guard. The Sacred Band fought with relentless determination, cutting through the enemy ranks. King Cleombrotus was struck down in the melee, and many of his best soldiers fell alongside him. Meanwhile, the rest of the Theban line held its ground without engaging fully, allowing the main thrust of the attack to carry the day. Once the Spartan right collapsed, the rest of the army began to falter. The result was a stunning and unprecedented victory for Thebes. For the first time in living memory, the Spartans had been decisively defeated in pitched battle, not by overwhelming numbers or trickery, but by superior strategy and courage on the field. The implications of Leuctra were profound. Militarily, it shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. Politically, it emboldened cities across Greece to challenge Spartan dominance. Several Peloponnesian states, long forced to submit to Sparta, began to reassert their independence. Even within Laconia itself, the balance of power shifted. The once unquestioned loyalty of the Perioikoi, Sparta's free but non-citizen neighbors, began to waver. Thebes followed its victory with an ambitious campaign to dismantle the Spartan system from within. Epaminondas led an army into the Peloponnese, where he liberated Messenia, a region that had been under Spartan control for centuries. The Helots, a population of serfs bound to the land, were granted freedom, and a new city, Mycenaean, was founded to solidify their independence. This act struck at the heart of Spartan society, which depended on Helot labor to support its citizen soldiers. Epaminondas also encouraged the formation of new regional alliances, such as the Arcadian League, to further isolate Sparta. In doing so, he attempted to replace the old Peloponnesian League with a network of federations that would prevent any single city from dominating the Greek world. His vision was one of cooperative autonomy, backed by Theban military strength. Yet Theban hegemony would prove to be short-lived. Though victorious, Thebes lacked the administrative infrastructure and naval resources to sustain long-term control over distant allies. Moreover, its assertive policies alarmed Athens and other polis, leading to renewed rivalries and shifting coalitions. Epaminondas, the central figure behind Theban power, was killed in battle in the year 362 BCE at Mantinea, bringing an end to the city's golden era of leadership. The Battle of Leuctra and the rise of Thebes revealed the volatility of the Greek city-state system. Power could shift rapidly, not only due to wealth or numbers, but through leadership, innovation, and opportunity. The city-states remained fiercely independent and often suspicious of collective governance, making lasting unity difficult. While Thebes had challenged the old order, it had not replaced it with a stable new one. As the Greek city-states remained embroiled in competition and recovery after the disruptions of Theban hegemony, few looked north with any seriousness. The kingdom of Macedon, located on the periphery of the Greek world, had long been seen by the southern Polis as semi-Greek at best, a land of kings, tribal customs, and rough warriors. Its people spoke a dialect considered crude by Attic standards, and its royal court was often dismissed as backward in comparison to the civic life of cities like Athens or Thebes. But while the southern city-states exhausted themselves in constant rivalry, Macedon was transforming. At the center of this transformation was Philip II, who ascended to the throne in the year 359 BCE. His rise would change not only the destiny of Macedon, but of the entire Greek world. Philip did not inherit a stable kingdom. When he took power, Macedon was surrounded by enemies and riddled with internal instability. The Illyrians had recently killed his brother, the previous king, and threatened to invade again. The Paeonians, Thracians, and rival Macedonian claimants all posed additional dangers. Philip, though young, had already spent time as a hostage in Thebes, where he absorbed firsthand the military tactics and political structures of the Greeks. That experience would prove essential. One of Philip's first moves as king was to stabilize his borders through diplomacy and strategic marriages. At the same time, he began a sweeping reorganization of the Macedonian army. Borrowing from Greek practices but adapting them to his needs, he created a new military formation, the Macedonian phalanx. This formation used longer spears known as sarissas, which measured up to 18 feet. These gave his infantry greater reach than the traditional Greek hoplites. The soldiers were better trained, drilled regularly, and supported by a highly mobile cavalry, especially the companion cavalry, drawn from the Macedonian nobility and loyal directly to the king. Philip's army was not just a fighting force, it was an instrument of unification and centralization. He reduced the power of regional nobles and created a professional military class dependent on royal patronage. This gave him unprecedented control over his kingdom and enabled rapid expansion. Philip did not rush into southern Greece immediately. Instead, he focused first on securing Macedonian influence in neighboring territories. He defeated the Illyrians, brought the Paeonians to heel, and gradually absorbed Thracian lands. With each victory, he gained new soldiers, wealth, and prestige. His first significant entrance into Greek affairs came during the Third Sacred War, a conflict that began in the early 350s BCE between the Phocians and the Delphic Amphictyonic League. The League, a religious coalition of Greek states, had condemned Phocis for cultivating sacred land belonging to Apollo and imposed heavy fines. The Phocians, rather than submit, seized control of the oracle at Delphi and used its treasury to fund mercenary armies. Thebes, Athens, and other major states were drawn into the conflict on various sides. Philip saw an opportunity. Posing as a defender of the sacred traditions of Greece, he intervened against the Phocians. With carefully timed campaigns and a growing reputation, he was eventually granted membership in the Amphictyonic Council, an honor traditionally reserved for established Greek powers. This recognition gave Philip both legitimacy and a foothold in central Greece. Meanwhile, in Athens, concerns about Macedon were growing. One of the loudest voices warning of the danger was the orator Demosthenes, who delivered a series of speeches known as the Philippics. In them, he urged the Athenians to recognize the threat posed by Philip's ambitions and to unite with other states before it was too late. Despite such warnings, the city-states found it difficult to set aside their rivalries. Philip, in contrast, continued building coalitions. He married into influential families, offered favorable peace terms to potential allies, and used bribes and threats as needed. His mastery of both diplomacy and warfare made him a formidable and unpredictable force. By the late 340s BCE, Philip had become the most powerful figure in Greece. His final step toward full dominance came in the year 338 BCE at the Battle of Chaeronea. In this engagement, Philip faced a coalition led by Athens and Thebes, two of the strongest remaining city-states that still opposed his influence. The battle took place in Boeotia, near the city of Chaeronea. The Macedonian army, including Philip's son Alexander, who commanded the left wing, faced a numerically comparable but less cohesive Greek force. The decisive moment came when Philip executed a calculated retreat on the right, drawing in the Athenian line. As the Athenians overextended, the Macedonians regrouped and launched a counterattack. At the same time, Alexander's forces broke through the Theban line, crushing the elite sacred band in combat. Nearly all members of the sacred band were killed, a symbolic end to Theban power. The victory at Chaeronea marked the end of effective resistance to Macedonian dominance in Greece. Philip established a new political structure called the League of Corinth, which united the Greek states, excluding Sparta, under his leadership. Each city retained its internal autonomy but pledged allegiance to Philip in foreign affairs and agreed not to fight one another. This arrangement ended the centuries-long pattern of constant warfare among the Polis. Philip's intentions, however, reached beyond Greece. He declared a common war against the Persian Empire, invoking the old cause of liberating Greek cities in Asia Minor. This campaign would never be led by Philip himself. In the year 336 BCE, he was assassinated under mysterious circumstances, possibly involving palace intrigue or rivalries within his own court. Upon the sudden assassination of Philip II, the Greek world held its breath. The king who had unified the fractious city-states under Macedonian leadership was gone, and his successor was a young man not yet 20 years old. That successor, Alexander, son of Philip and the Epirot princess Olympias, would not only hold his father's fragile empire together, but launch one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in history. His conquests would extend from Greece to Egypt and deep into Asia, radically reshaping the ancient world and leaving a legacy that outlived the era of the independent Greek polis. Alexander inherited not just a throne, but an army, a powerful administrative structure, and a vision already in motion. Though young, he had been groomed for leadership. His education had been overseen by none other than Aristotle, who instilled in him a love of Homeric ideals and philosophical inquiry. More importantly, Alexander had already demonstrated his capabilities on the battlefield, notably at Chaeronea, where he had played a key role in breaking the Theban lines under his father's command. Yet, Alexander's first challenge was not in Persia, it was in Greece itself. Upon hearing of Philip's death, several city-states, especially Thebes, believed that Macedonian control might collapse. Thebes openly rebelled, hoping to throw off foreign rule. In response, Alexander acted swiftly. He marched south with speed and decisiveness, arriving in Boeotia before his enemies expected it. Thebes was besieged and, after refusing terms, was brutally destroyed. Its population was either killed or sold into slavery, and the city was razed, spared only its temples and the house of the poet Pindar. This harsh punishment sent a message to the rest of Greece. Macedon would not tolerate defiance. Athens, which had hesitated to support Thebes, submitted without resistance. With Greece subdued once more, Alexander could now turn his attention to the grander objective, the invasion of the Persian Empire. In the year 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor with a well-trained force composed of Macedonians and allied Greek contingents. His army was significantly smaller than the Persian forces he would face, but it was far better organized, disciplined, and led. The campaign began with a symbolic visit to Troy, where Alexander paid homage to Achilles, his legendary hero and supposed ancestor. The first major battle occurred at the Granicus River, where Alexander's forces routed a Persian army led by local satraps. The victory opened the gates to Western Asia Minor. City after city either fell or surrendered to Alexander. His policy of clemency toward the cities that submitted and brutal treatment of those that resisted echoed the tactics he had used in Greece. From there, Alexander moved south and confronted the Persian king Darius III for the first time at the Battle of Issus in 333 BCE. Though Darius's army was much larger, Alexander's tactical brilliance and bold leadership turned the tide. In a dramatic moment, Darius fled the battlefield, abandoning his family and royal treasures. Alexander treated the captured royal women with dignity, reinforcing his image not only as a conqueror, but also as a statesman. Continuing south along the eastern Mediterranean, Alexander besieged the fortified island city of Tyre, which resisted for several months. The eventual fall of Tyre was marked by the slaughter of much of its population and the enslavement of thousands, a message to others who might resist. He then marched into Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator. In Egypt, Alexander founded the city of Alexandria, destined to become one of the most important centers of learning and commerce in the ancient world. In Egypt, he visited the oracle of Ammon at Siwa Oasis, where he was reportedly confirmed as a divine son, an affirmation that would play a growing role in his later self-image. Though the exact details of the oracle's pronouncement are lost, it appears to have strengthened Alexander's belief in his unique destiny. In the year 331 BCE, Alexander once again faced Darius, this time at the Battle of Gaugamela. Despite the vast size of the Persian army, Alexander's tactical flexibility and use of the phalanx and cavalry coordination led to another decisive victory. Darius fled once more, only to be later murdered by his own men. With this defeat, the heart of the Persian Empire was open to Alexander. He marched into the major capitals of Persia, Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, seizing immense wealth and asserting control over the administrative centers of the empire. In a controversial act, Alexander allowed the burning of Persepolis, perhaps as revenge for the earlier Persian sack of Athens during the Persian Wars. This act, whether symbolic or impulsive, marked a turning point in his campaign, from liberation to conquest. But Alexander did not stop. Driven by ambition, curiosity, and perhaps the desire to fulfill a vision of universal empire, he continued eastward. He pursued Bactrian and Sogdian resistance, married the local noblewoman Roxana, and sought to integrate Persians into his administration. He adopted Persian dress and customs, infuriating many of his Macedonian officers, who saw this as betrayal of Greek values. In India, Alexander crossed the Indus River and defeated King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes, impressed by Porus's courage and command. He appointed him as a subordinate ruler, showing the blend of respect and pragmatism that defined his approach to empire. Yet the campaigns in India strained his army. Exhausted and disillusioned, his troops finally refused to go further east. Alexander was forced to turn back. On the return journey, he endured harsh conditions crossing the Gedrosian desert, a decision that cost many lives and further weakened his forces. Still, he returned to Babylon in triumph, master of the largest empire the world had yet seen. In Babylon, Alexander began planning new campaigns, possibly against Arabia or even Carthage, but those plans would never come to pass. In the year 323 BCE, he fell ill and died under mysterious circumstances. Some suggest fever, others poison, but no consensus exists. He was only 32 years old. His sudden death left a vast, diverse empire without a clear successor. Though he had an unborn son and a half-brother, neither was capable of ruling. What followed was a period of chaos, as Alexander's generals, known as the Diadochi, fought bitterly for control. The empire quickly fragmented into several Hellenistic kingdoms. Following the untimely death of Alexander the Great in Babylon, the immense empire he had forged was left without a clear and capable heir. His infant son, Alexander IV, and his half-brother, Philip Aridaeus, were both proclaimed kings in name, but real power quickly passed into the hands of Alexander's generals, known as the Diadochi, or successors. Their rivalry, ambition, and military strength would fracture the unified empire, giving rise to a new geopolitical order, the Hellenistic kingdoms. These kingdoms, larger, wealthier, and more centralized than the old city-states, represented a new phase in the history of the Greek world. Though the ideal of the polis still survived in form, real autonomy was rare. The Greek city-states now found themselves functioning within the orbit of sprawling dynasties ruled by monarchs who wielded both Macedonian military authority and Persian-style royal legitimacy. The first and most powerful of the Diadochi was Ptolemy, who seized control of Egypt. He established the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled from the newly founded city of Alexandria. Alexandria quickly became the intellectual and cultural center of the Greek world, home to the famed Library of Alexandria, the museum, and some of the greatest scholars, poets, and scientists of the age. Although the Ptolemies adopted Egyptian royal traditions and were worshipped as divine pharaohs, they spoke Greek and maintained strong ties to Hellenic culture. In the east, Seleucus took control of much of the former Persian Empire, founding the Seleucid dynasty, which extended from Asia Minor to Mesopotamia and parts of Central Asia. The Seleucids faced challenges in managing such a vast and diverse territory, especially as they tried to balance the Greek elite with local traditions. They established Greek-style cities across their realm, including Antioch, Seleucia, and others, in which Greek settlers formed privileged communities. These cities often received favorable treatment and operated with familiar civic institutions, though always under royal oversight. In the Macedonian homeland and parts of Greece, Antigonus and his descendants, the Antigonid dynasty, maintained control. Their rule over mainland Greece was uneven and frequently contested by local resistance, revolts, and shifting alliances among polis that sought to retain a measure of autonomy. Despite this imperial dominance, the Greek city-states did not disappear. Many continued to function as important centers of local government, trade, and culture. In the Peloponnese, for example, cities like Corinth and Argos remained vibrant, while Delphi, with its oracle and sanctuary, retained religious significance. However, City-states now had to navigate a world in which major decisions about war, trade routes, or alliances were shaped by kings rather than assemblies. The dynamic between the cities and the new monarchies varied. In some cases, rulers encouraged civic life, sponsored building projects, and supported local religious institutions. In others, they imposed garrisons, extracted resources, or installed friendly regimes to ensure loyalty. Diplomacy became an essential tool for city elites, who often sent embassies to royal courts seeking favors, tax exemptions, or military protection. At the same time, a new kind of federation emerged in parts of Greece, the leagues. These were voluntary associations of polis that pooled resources and coordinated defense. The most prominent of these were the Aetolian League in central Greece and the Achaean League in the Peloponnese. These leagues provided a framework for cooperation among cities while allowing a degree of local autonomy. They also became vehicles for resistance against Macedonian and later Roman encroachment. The Achaean League in particular expanded significantly during the 3rd century BCE and adopted a federal constitution with shared political institutions. Each member city retained its own laws but participated in a common assembly and elected magistrates who managed foreign policy and military affairs. This model offered a partial solution to the challenge of preserving polis traditions within a world dominated by larger powers. Another area of continuity was religion. Despite the rise of monarchies and the growing importance of royal cults, the traditional pantheon of Greek gods continued to be worshipped in the cities. Temples were built or restored, festivals flourished, and local priesthoods remained influential. However, new deities and syncretic forms of worship also appeared, blending Greek and Eastern traditions. For instance, Serapis, a composite god combining Greek and Egyptian elements, was promoted by the Ptolemies as a unifying religious figure. Economically, the Hellenistic period brought prosperity to many Greek cities, especially those connected to trade routes across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. Coinage became standardized across many regions, facilitating commerce. Agricultural innovations and the expansion of markets also contributed to urban growth. Cities like Alexandria, Rhodes, and Pergamon became hubs of wealth and culture. Culturally, the Greek language, especially in its coin form, spread widely and became the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean. Greek art, architecture, and education influenced elites from Egypt to Bactria. The gymnasium, theater, and agora appeared in cities far removed from the Aegean. At the same time, local traditions persisted and interacted with Greek forms, creating a rich and diverse cultural mosaic. The Hellenistic world was also marked by increasing social stratification. In the cities, wealthy elites controlled politics and benefited from royal patronage, while large numbers of craftsmen, merchants, and laborers worked to sustain urban economies. Slavery remained widespread. Women, though still largely excluded from formal politics, gained more visibility in public life, especially in royal courts and religious roles. The interaction between city and king was not always peaceful. Uprisings occurred, particularly when cities felt their autonomy was threatened or their interests neglected. In some cases, leagues or alliances of cities challenged royal authority directly. One of the most persistent points of conflict was between the Achaean League and the Antigonid kings, especially over control of Corinth and other strategic locations in southern Greece. By the 2nd century BCE, a new and even more powerful actor entered the scene: Rome. Initially involved in Greek affairs as an ally or mediator, Rome gradually asserted more direct control. The Macedonian Wars, fought between Rome and the Antigonid rulers, culminated in the defeat of Perseus of Macedon at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE. This marked the end of the Antigonid dynasty and the beginning of Roman dominance in Greek affairs. Though the Romans allowed many city-states to retain nominal independence, their power was absolute. Greek cities were now subjects of a foreign republic, their fates tied to the politics of Rome. Yet, even under Roman rule, the traditions of the polis endured. City councils continued to meet, Festivals were celebrated, and public buildings were constructed in classical styles. The conquests of Alexander the Great had redrawn the political map of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, but the Hellenistic world that emerged in his wake was more than just a reshuffling of power. It became a dynamic era of intellectual growth and cultural exchange. Freed from the strict political structures of the Polis, yet enriched by broader economic networks and royal patronage, Greek thinkers and artists began exploring new subjects, adopting new methods, and reaching new audiences. In this fertile environment, science, philosophy, literature, and art flourished on a scale not previously seen. One of the epicenters of this intellectual flowering was Alexandria in Egypt, founded by Alexander and expanded under the rule of the Ptolemies. Here, the fusion of Greek, Egyptian, and Near Eastern traditions created a unique cultural climate. At the heart of Alexandria's intellectual life was the Library of Alexandria, an ambitious project that aimed to collect all human knowledge. It was supported by the Museum, a scholarly institution dedicated to research and study. Together, they represented a revolutionary model for organized learning. Among the many scholars who worked in Alexandria was Eratosthenes, a polymath who made lasting contributions in geography, mathematics, and astronomy. He famously calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy by comparing the angles of the sun's rays in two different Egyptian cities at noon on the summer solstice. His estimate, though slightly off by modern standards, was a groundbreaking demonstration of empirical observation and mathematical reasoning. Another key figure was Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system. He argued that the Earth rotated on its axis and revolved around the sun, a bold theory that would not gain widespread acceptance until many centuries later. His ideas, though not adopted by his contemporaries, revealed the growing ambition of Hellenistic science to challenge conventional wisdom and explore the natural world through logic and observation. In the field of physics and engineering, Archimedes of Syracuse stands as perhaps the greatest mind of the age. Although he spent much of his life in his native city rather than Alexandria, he corresponded with scholars across the Hellenistic world. Archimedes developed principles of leverage, buoyancy, and hydrostatics. His inventions, such as the compound pulley, the Archimedean screw, and various war machines, combined theoretical insight with practical application. His mathematical writings laid the groundwork for integral calculus, anticipating concepts that would not be formalized until the modern era. Medicine also advanced significantly during the Hellenistic period. In Alexandria, physicians such as Herophilos and Erasistratus conducted anatomical studies that were previously restricted by religious taboos. Herophilos performed dissections on human cadavers and described the nervous system in detail, distinguishing between sensory and motor nerves. He also studied the brain and the pulse, offering insights that remained influential for centuries. Alongside science, Hellenistic philosophy adapted to new political realities. The traditional focus on civic participation and ethical virtue, central to classical thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, gave way to more personal and cosmopolitan concerns. With the polis no longer the primary framework for life, philosophers turned inward, asking how individuals could find peace and purpose in a vast and unpredictable world. One of the major schools to emerge was Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium. Stoicism taught that virtue was the only true good and that external circumstances, wealth, health, status, were ultimately indifferent. The Stoic ideal was the sage, a person who lived in accordance with nature and reason, unaffected by fortune or misfortune. Stoic ethics appealed to many living under monarchy or empire, where individual autonomy had become more limited. Another influential school was Epicureanism, founded by Epicurus. In contrast to the Stoics, the Epicureans emphasized pleasure as the highest good, though not in the sense of indulgence. For Epicurus, true pleasure meant the absence of pain and disturbance, a life of moderation, friendship, and philosophical reflection. The Epicurean garden was a community of like-minded individuals who sought tranquility away from political life. A third school, skepticism, advanced by thinkers such as Pyrrho and later Sextus Empiricus, questioned whether certain knowledge was even possible. Skeptics advocated for epoche, or the suspension of judgment, as a way to achieve peace of mind in the face of uncertainty. In literature, Hellenistic poets explored new themes and forms, often focusing on private emotion, mythological reinterpretation, and intricate language. Callimachus, a librarian at Alexandria, emphasized brevity and refinement, rejecting the grand epics of the past in favor of shorter, polished poems. His work influenced generations of Roman and later European poets. Theocritus from Sicily pioneered pastoral poetry, depicting the lives and loves of shepherds in idealized rural settings, a genre that would remain popular well into the modern era. Historical writing also evolved. While earlier historians like Herodotus and Thucydides had focused on wars and politics, Hellenistic historians expanded their scope. Polybius, a Greek hostage in Rome, wrote a history of the rise of the Roman Republic. His work emphasized causality, institutions, and the interplay of chance and character, setting a new standard for analytical history. Art in the Hellenistic Age became more expressive, realistic, and focused on individual experience. Sculptors moved beyond the idealized forms of the classical period to depict dynamic poses, intense emotion, and a wider range of subjects, including children, the elderly, foreigners, and even deities shown in moments of vulnerability. The statue, known as the Laocoon group, discovered much later in Rome but dated to the Hellenistic period, illustrates the emotional intensity and complex composition typical of the era. The winged victory of Samothrace, another masterpiece, conveys movement and triumph, capturing a moment in time with dramatic flair. In architecture, cities like Pergamon showcased monumental construction. The great altar of Zeus at Pergamon, with its sweeping friezes and sculptural drama, reflected both religious devotion and royal power. Urban planning also advanced, with grid layouts, public fountains, theaters, and libraries designed to serve large, diverse populations. Despite these achievements, the Hellenistic world was not without tension. The vast empires created by the Diadochi were prone to instability, dynastic struggles, and regional revolts. Cultural integration was uneven. While Greek became the dominant language of administration and high culture, many local populations retained their native traditions and often viewed Hellenization with suspicion or resistance. As the Hellenistic kingdoms flourished and Greek culture spread across Egypt, Asia Minor, and the Near East, a new force was quietly ascending in the Western Mediterranean. The Roman Republic, originally a modest city-state on the Italian peninsula, had grown into a formidable military and political power. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome had not only unified Italy under its control, but had begun to project its influence beyond the peninsula. The Greek city-states, long accustomed to their own rivalries and the dominance of Hellenistic monarchies, were soon drawn into the orbit of this rising republic. The earliest major encounter between Rome and the Greek world came during the Pyrrhic War, named after King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a cousin of Alexander the Great. In the early 3rd century BCE, the city of Tarentum, a Greek colony in southern Italy, sought help against Rome's growing influence in the region. Pyrrhus responded by crossing the Adriatic with a professional army that included elephants, an unfamiliar sight to Roman soldiers. In a series of battles, Pyrrhus achieved costly victories, including at Heraclea and Asculum, but his gains were unsustainable. The term Pyrrhic victory originates from these campaigns, victories so costly that they left the winner weakened. Despite his tactical brilliance, Pyrrhus was unable to break Roman resolve. Eventually, he withdrew from Italy and returned to Epirus. The war demonstrated Rome's capacity to endure losses, learn from its enemies, and adapt its military tactics. It also signaled the beginning of Rome's involvement in Greek affairs. Rome's next major encounter with the Greek world came through its wars with Carthage, a powerful maritime empire based in North Africa. During the Second Punic War, Carthaginian general Hannibal invaded Italy and formed alliances with several Greek cities in the south. Though these alliances ultimately failed to tip the balance, they brought Rome into closer contact with the broader Greek world. Following its victory over Carthage, Rome turned its attention eastward. In the early 2nd century BCE, Rome intervened in disputes between the Hellenistic kingdoms, particularly in Macedon and Asia Minor. These interventions were often framed as efforts to defend the freedom of the Greek cities, but they served Roman interests as well. The First Macedonian War broke out during the Second Punic War as Philip V of Macedon allied with Carthage. Although this initial conflict ended indecisively, it set the stage for deeper Roman involvement. A more serious confrontation occurred in the Second Macedonian War, in which Rome defeated Philip V at the Battle of Cynocephalae. This battle was significant not just for the Roman victory, but for the demonstration of the Roman manipular legion's flexibility and effectiveness against the traditional Macedonian phalanx. After the victory, Rome proclaimed the freedom of the Greeks at the Isthmian Games in Corinth. The announcement was greeted with celebration across the Greek world, but the reality was more complex. While Rome withdrew its forces for a time, it had clearly established itself as the final arbiter in Greek political affairs. The illusion of autonomy would not last. The decisive shift occurred during the Third Macedonian War, when the Roman general Lucius Aemilius Polis defeated Perseus of Macedon, the son of Philip V, at the Battle of Pydna. The Roman victory was overwhelming. The Macedonian phalanx, once feared across the ancient world, collapsed before the more adaptable Roman formations. The Antigonid dynasty was abolished, and Macedon was divided into separate republics under Roman oversight. Around the same time, Rome also moved against the Seleucid Empire, which had tried to exert influence in Asia Minor and the Aegean. The Battle of Magnesia, fought against Antiochus III, further demonstrated Rome's military superiority. The Seleucids were forced to abandon most of their territory in Asia Minor and pay a heavy indemnity. The final blow to Greek political independence came with the destruction of Corinth in 146 BCE. The Achaean League, which had resisted Roman interference, was decisively defeated. Corinth, one of the wealthiest and most culturally significant cities in Greece, was sacked and burned. Many of its inhabitants were killed or enslaved. The city remained in ruins for decades, a stark symbol of Roman dominance. That same year, Rome also destroyed Carthage, ending the Third Punic War. The twin destructions of Carthage and Corinth marked the symbolic and practical end of resistance to Roman expansion in both the western and eastern Mediterranean. With Corinth's fall, Rome formally annexed Greece as a province. Over the next decades, more regions would be absorbed. The political landscape that had once been shaped by the likes of Athens, Sparta, and Thebes was now part of a growing imperial system headquartered in Italy. Yet even as Rome conquered Greece, it revered Greek culture. Roman elites learned Greek, studied the works of Plato and Aristotle, and commissioned copies of classical Greek art. Roman education, philosophy, architecture, and literature were deeply influenced by Hellenic traditions. Cities like Athens and Rhodes remained centers of learning. Wealthy Roman families sent their sons to be educated by Greek tutors and philosophers. In a sense, Greek culture conquered its conquerors. While the political autonomy of the Polis was extinguished, their intellectual and artistic legacies became foundational to Roman identity. The Romans saw themselves as inheritors of Greek civilization, and this sense of cultural continuity ensured the survival of Greek ideas well into the imperial age. For the Greek city-states, the transition was complex. On the one hand, many cities retained local self-governance, especially in religious and civic matters. Municipal councils still met, festivals were still celebrated, and temples continued to function. On the other hand, strategic decisions, taxation, and military matters were firmly in Roman hands. Revolt was no longer a viable option. Economically, some cities prospered under Roman rule, benefiting from the Pax Romana and the vast trade networks it supported. Others declined, especially those that had been centers of political resistance. Corinth, once rebuilt by Julius Caesar, eventually regained some of its former wealth, But it was now a Roman colony, with Roman institutions. Culturally, the fusion of Greek and Roman traditions created a new shared heritage. Sculptors, poets, and philosophers continued their work, often with Roman patronage. Theaters in Greek cities staged both classical tragedies and new Roman comedies. Religious syncretism blended gods and rituals from both cultures. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, the Greek world had entered its final stage of political autonomy. The relentless rise of the Roman Republic had already unseated Macedon, humbled the Seleucid kings, and reconfigured alliances throughout the Hellenistic East. Greek cities now found themselves negotiating their survival under a new political order. Yet not all accepted this change quietly. One last attempt to defend Greek independence would culminate in a catastrophic event, the destruction of Corinth in 146 BCE. This moment marked not just the fall of a single city, but the formal conclusion of Greece's centuries-long era of city-state sovereignty. The road to Corinth's destruction began with growing tensions between Rome and the Achaean League, a federation of Greek city-states primarily based in the Peloponnese. The Achaean League had expanded significantly in the previous decades, incorporating powerful cities such as Corinth and Argos. As the League's influence grew, so too did its assertiveness in regional affairs. This did not go unnoticed in Rome, which by this time had established itself as the dominant arbiter in Greek politics following its defeat of Macedon and the dismantling of the Antigonid monarchy. Rome's relationship with the Achaean League had been uneasy for some time. While Rome had previously supported the League's growth as a counterbalance to other powers, it grew concerned that the League was becoming too powerful and politically unstable. Disagreements flared over issues of foreign policy, legal jurisdiction, and the treatment of cities within the League that held separate diplomatic ties with Rome. Matters escalated when Rome ordered that several cities in central Greece, including Sparta, be removed from the League. The Achaean assembly, dominated by hardline leaders, refused to comply. Anti-Roman sentiment had taken deep root, especially in Corinth, where political leaders viewed Roman demands as humiliating violations of Greek sovereignty. Speeches in the League's assembly denounced Rome, and Roman ambassadors were reportedly insulted or expelled, an act that the Senate considered intolerable. Rome responded decisively. A military campaign was launched under the command of Lucius Mummius, a Roman general tasked with subduing the League and restoring order. The conflict, known as the Achaean War, was brief but brutal. While the League mobilized its forces, its military capacity was no match for Rome's seasoned legions. Battles in central Greece swiftly ended in Roman victories, and the League's resistance collapsed. The final confrontation came at Corinth, the League's wealthiest and most symbolically important city. Perched on the narrow isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to mainland Greece, Corinth had long been a major commercial hub and cultural center. Its location gave it strategic significance, controlling land and sea routes between northern and southern Greece. Its art, architecture, and trade made it one of the jewels of the Hellenic world. In the face of Roman advance, Corinth's citizens prepared for siege, but the defense proved short-lived. The Roman legions, better trained and equipped, breached the city's walls and overwhelmed its defenders. What followed was one of the most infamous episodes in Roman expansion: the sack of Corinth. Lucius Mummius, despite being a man of relatively humble origins, acted with brutal efficiency. The city was set ablaze. Temples, public buildings, and homes were destroyed. The population was either massacred or sold into slavery. Works of art and cultural treasures were looted and transported to Rome, where they adorned temples, palaces, and public spaces. Mummius, though reportedly indifferent to art, oversaw one of the largest transfers of Greek material culture to the Roman world. The destruction of Corinth sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean. It symbolized the definitive end of Greek resistance and the beginning of Roman provincial rule. In the same year, the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus destroyed Carthage, concluding the Third Punic War. The simultaneous annihilation of Carthage in the west and Corinth in the east marked a turning point. Rome had removed its two greatest cultural and military rivals. After the fall of Corinth, Rome dissolved the Achaean League. Many other Greek cities were stripped of their autonomy or placed under direct Roman administration. Although some cities retained nominal self-government, they now operated within the framework of Roman provincial governance. In time, the region would be formally organized as the province of Achaia. The fall of Corinth also reshaped Greek perceptions of their place in the world. Once the cultural and intellectual leaders of the Mediterranean, the Greeks now found themselves as subjects of a Latin-speaking republic whose institutions and traditions were alien to the Greek political experience. The ideals of citizenship, local deliberation, and civic pride that had defined the Polis for centuries were now subordinated to the authority of governors sent from Rome. Yet it would be misleading to view this moment as the disappearance of Greek influence. If anything, Greek culture became more widespread in the Roman world than ever before. Roman elites revered Greek literature, philosophy, and art. Educated Romans learned Greek as a second language, and many received their education from Greek tutors. Greek physicians, architects, and philosophers found employment across the Roman Empire. In many ways, Greek ideas became embedded in Roman institutions. Roman conquest did not erase the polis, but it did transform it. Greek cities continued to function as administrative centers, marketplaces, and religious communities. Their councils still convened, magistrates still served, and citizens still participated in local festivals and cults. However, the scope of their autonomy was now limited. Rome controlled military matters, taxation, and foreign policy. Cities that disobeyed imperial directives risked the same fate as Corinth. In response, many cities adapted. They cultivated relationships with Roman governors, built temples honoring Roman deities and emperors, and styled themselves as loyal partners in imperial rule. Some cities were granted civitas libera, or free city status, which afforded certain privileges in exchange for loyalty. Others became Roman colonies, settled by veterans and governed according to Roman law. In artistic terms, Roman patronage gave rise to a fusion of Greek and Roman styles. Sculpture, painting, and architecture reflected both traditions, creating a visual culture that bridged the classical and imperial worlds. Greek artists and craftsmen found new opportunities under Roman rule, often working in cities far from their homeland. In the centuries following the fall of Corinth, Greek cities entered a new phase of existence. Their independence was gone, and the age of the polis as a sovereign political force had ended. Yet the city remained central to Greek life. Under Roman rule, the polis did not vanish, it was transformed. Greek cities adapted to a new imperial reality by embracing selective Romanization while preserving their cultural identity. In many ways, they became models of coexistence, places where Greek traditions and Roman governance intertwined. After the conquest of Greece in the mid-2nd century BCE, Rome integrated the region into its provincial system. The province of Achaia, officially formed in the aftermath of Corinth's destruction, included most of mainland Greece. Macedonia had already been established as a Roman province following the defeat of Perseus of Macedon. These provinces were governed by Roman officials, usually former magistrates, who oversaw taxation, legal affairs, and security. However, Rome often allowed a high degree of local autonomy in the day-to-day affairs of the cities. Each city continued to be administered by its own council, or boule, composed of local aristocrats. Magistrates such as strategoi, archons, and grammates remained in place, elected by citizens or appointed by local traditions. Public festivals, religious rituals, and theatrical performances continued as before. Temples were maintained, and gymnasia functioned as both physical training centers and schools for the elite. In short, the structures of Greek civic life remained remarkably intact. What changed was the framework in which these cities operated. All decisions of regional or military importance were subject to Roman approval. Cities were expected to pay taxes, provide resources for Roman officials and their entourages, and ensure stability within their borders. Those that cooperated were often rewarded with privileges, including reduced taxation or symbolic honors. Some cities, like Athens and Rhodes, were granted free city status, allowing them a degree of legal and fiscal independence in exchange for loyalty. The Roman emperors also recognized the symbolic value of these Greek cities. They patronized them, visited them, and used them to display their own power and culture. Emperors such as Augustus, Hadrian, and Antoninus Pius invested heavily in public buildings, roads, and festivals. Athens, in particular, benefited from this imperial attention. Augustus visited the city, supported its institutions, and reinforced its role as a center of philosophy and education. Hadrian, a devoted admirer of Greek culture, built libraries, temples, and even a new neighborhood in Athens, sometimes referred to as Hadrianopolis. Under Roman rule, Athens became a beacon of learning once more. Its schools of philosophy attracted students from across the empire. The Academy and the Lyceum, though no longer directly affiliated with Plato or Aristotle, were revived as institutions of higher learning. Stoics, Epicureans, and Platonists taught in the agora and public lecture halls. Wealthy Romans sent their sons to Athens for education, believing that a grounding in Greek rhetoric and philosophy was essential for a successful political career. Elsewhere, cities like Ephesus, Pergamon, and Smyrna in Asia Minor thrived as cultural and commercial centers. These cities, though originally Greek colonies or Hellenized towns, flourished under Roman provincial governance. They maintained Greek civic structures, spoke the Greek language, and honored both Greek gods and Roman emperors. Religion, too, evolved under Roman rule. Traditional Greek deities continued to be worshipped in public festivals and household rituals. Temples to Zeus, Athena, Apollo, and others were restored or expanded. At the same time, new forms of worship emerged, often blending Greek and Roman elements. The imperial cult, which honored the Roman emperor as a divine or semi-divine figure, became a fixture in many cities. Temples dedicated to emperors stood alongside those of ancient gods, and priests of the imperial cult became influential figures in civic life. This religious fusion did not eliminate older traditions but layered new meanings onto them. In cities like Corinth, rebuilt by Julius Caesar as a Roman colony, the blending of Roman authority with Greek religious life created a hybrid cultural environment. Greek festivals, such as the Panathenea in Athens or the Great Dionysia, continued, often with added displays of Roman imperial grandeur. Economically, Greek cities became integrated into the broader Roman trade networks. Goods from the eastern provinces passed through Greek ports en route to Rome, and in return, Roman goods flowed into Greek markets. Cities like Delos, once a sacred site, became bustling commercial hubs. Roman merchants settled in Greek cities, and Greek artisans found new markets for their work. Socially, the lines between Greek and Roman began to blur. Intermarriage between Greek elites and Roman officials became common. Greek families adopted Roman names and customs, especially as Roman citizenship began to be extended more broadly throughout the empire. By the 2nd century CE, many leading citizens in Greek cities were Roman citizens as well. Yet, despite these changes, the memory of the classical polis endured. In inscriptions, local elites still celebrated their ancestry, civic service, and cultural achievements. Statues of philosophers, poets, and legendary lawgivers adorned public spaces. Speeches delivered in the ecclesia or the theater echoed the oratory of Demosthenes and Isocrates. The past was not forgotten, it was repurposed to serve the present. In many ways, the polis became a symbol of continuity within the vast and often impersonal Roman world. It offered a sense of belonging, community, and identity. While the emperors ruled from Rome or distant provinces, the city remained the center of daily life for most inhabitants. Festivals, assemblies, gymnasium debates, and market transactions all unfolded within its walls. Over time, new challenges would emerge. The spread of Christianity in the later Roman Empire introduced new tensions between traditional pagan practices and emerging Christian communities. Many Greek cities became early centers of Christian thought, with bishops assuming civic roles once held by magistrates. The eventual Christianization of the empire would further reshape Greek religious and civic identity, a transformation explored in later historical periods. By the time the Roman Empire had fully absorbed the Greek world, the independent polis had ceased to exist as a political institution. Yet, the legacy of the Greek city-state did not fade with the rise of imperial rule. Instead, its ideas, cultural expressions, and civic traditions found new life across centuries, transmitted through empires, reshaped by religion, and eventually rediscovered and reinterpreted by later civilizations. From the halls of Byzantium to the salons of Enlightenment Europe, the story of the Greek polis continued, leaving an imprint far beyond its physical walls. In the eastern half of the Roman Empire, what would later be called the Byzantine Empire, Greek culture remained dominant. Even as Latin continued as the language of law and administration in the West, the East held fast to Greek. Cities such as Constantinople, Thessaloniki, and Athens remained vibrant centers of urban life, trade, and education. Byzantine cities were no longer governed by assemblies or popular magistrates in the classical sense, but many retained physical and institutional elements inherited from their ancient past. Byzantine emperors, especially from the early Christian centuries, saw themselves as inheritors of both Roman and Hellenic traditions. Church leaders and imperial officials were often educated in the Greek classics, and works of Plato, Aristotle, and Homer were copied and studied in Christian monasteries and imperial schools. Though reinterpreted through the lens of Christian theology, these texts continued to shape Byzantine philosophy, rhetoric, and law. One of the most enduring legacies of the polis within Byzantium was the civic identity that survived in urban institutions. While political power was centralized in Constantinople, cities maintained local structures, often rooted in their ancient past. Civic festivals were adapted into Christian forms, and public spaces like agoras and theaters were converted into markets or churches. The Greek Orthodox Church, with its strong local hierarchies, often filled the void left by the disappearance of the citizen assembly, becoming the focal point of community life. Even more important, the preservation of ancient texts by Byzantine scholars allowed Greek political thought to survive long after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. When Constantinople eventually fell to the Ottoman Turks in the 15th century, many Greek-speaking scholars fled westward to Italy, carrying manuscripts of Aristotle, Plato, Thucydides, and other classical authors. These texts, long forgotten or unknown in medieval Western Europe, ignited the Renaissance, a revival of classical knowledge, art, and learning that reawakened European interest in ancient Greece. The Renaissance was more than an artistic movement. It was a return to the civic ideals of classical antiquity. Thinkers such as Leonardo Bruni and Niccolò Machiavelli studied the political structures of Athens and Rome, seeking to understand the foundations of republican government. Humanist scholars praised the Greek emphasis on citizenship, public debate, and the moral duties of the individual within the community. In the Enlightenment that followed, Greek political thought became central to new theories of governance, law, and liberty. Philosophers such as Montesquieu, Rousseau, and John Stuart Mill referenced the Athenian democracy and the structure of the polis when debating the nature of representation, sovereignty, and civic virtue. The idea that citizens should participate directly in shaping the laws under which they live, first practiced in classical Athens, became a foundational principle for modern democratic societies. The American and French revolutions, two of the most influential political movements in modern history, drew inspiration from ancient Greece. The concept of a republic governed by its citizens, the belief in civic education, and the importance of a balanced constitution all had roots in the experiences of the Greek city-states. Even the architectural designs of public buildings in Washington, D.C. and Paris echoed the classical forms of the agora and the temple, visual testaments to the enduring appeal of Greek civic culture. Meanwhile, in the Greek-speaking world itself, the legacy of the polis continued in a different form. During centuries of Ottoman rule, Greek communities preserved their language, religious traditions, and collective memory of ancient autonomy. The church, local councils, and educational institutions kept alive a sense of identity rooted in Hellenic history. When the Greek War of Independence broke out in the early 19th century, revolutionaries invoked both the Christian faith and the glories of ancient Greece as sources of legitimacy. The newly established modern Greek state, founded in the year 1832, saw itself as a rebirth of the classical past. Cities like Athens were reimagined not just as modern capitals, but as continuations of their ancient predecessors. The restoration of ruins, the adoption of neoclassical architecture, and the naming of institutions and streets after ancient figures all reflected this deliberate continuity. In academic circles, the study of ancient Greece became a global endeavor. Archaeologists excavated sites such as Delphi, Olympia, and the Athenian Agora, uncovering temples, theaters, and inscriptions that offered new insights into the daily life of the polis. Scholars in universities from Oxford to Harvard debated the meaning of democracy in classical Athens, the military ethos of Sparta, and the philosophical schools of Hellenistic cities. Yet the legacy of the polis is not confined to scholarship or monuments. Its deeper impact lies in the enduring ideas it introduced, the notion of the citizen, not as a passive subject, but as an active participant in public life, the belief that law should be debated and decided by those who live under it, the conviction that education is essential to freedom and that public discourse is the cornerstone of political legitimacy. Of course, the ancient polis was not without its limitations. Citizenship was restricted, often excluding women, slaves, and foreigners. Democratic practices could be volatile, and civic pride could lead to exclusion or aggression. Yet despite these flaws, the Greek city-state represented one of the earliest and most influential attempts to construct a political order based on reasoned deliberation, shared responsibility, and individual agency. In the 21st century, cities across the globe, from Seoul to São Paulo, still echo with the spirit of the polis. Urban centers remain spaces where culture, politics, commerce, and education converge. Town halls, public forums, and civic associations draw from ancient models of participatory life. Debates over justice, citizenship, and democracy are not new. They are the latest chapters in a conversation that began more than 2 millennia ago in the sunlit assemblies of Athens, the austere councils of Sparta, and the bustling marketplaces of Corinth. The story of the Greek city empires is not just a tale of rise and fall, it is a narrative of resilience, reinvention, and legacy. Though their independence was lost, their influence has endured, shaping the world in ways their founders could scarcely have imagined. Their stones may have crumbled, their institutions may have faded, but the ideas born in the polis still stand, challenging, inspiring, and guiding those who seek to build a better civic life. With this, we conclude the journey through the rise, evolution, and enduring legacy of the Greek city-states. What began as small, scattered communities on the shores of the Aegean became one of the most influential forces in human history. The story of the polis is not just ancient history. It is our history.